but they don't. By the way, did you hear about the news about Floyd?
No.
Oh, Mario.
What
If
about,
Floyd
what about him?
We left off with if someone is unsure, if a metal utensil which was required to be immersed midaraisa. Remember last week we learned some are required midaraisa, some are only required midrabanan, but primarily metal and glass are required midaraisa, has been properly immersed, and you're unsure whether it's been immersed. So if it's midaraisa, it's got to be immersed again. If the obligation is merely midrabanan, and there is a doubt as to whether it was properly immersed, it is permitted to use the utensil because of the principle suffix drabanan lakula. That is, if there's uncertainty regarding a rabbinic law, the halacha is judged leniently. And this is recorded by the Sefer HaKashrus. Kliya chayiv bat vola, the suffix im hudbal, it's in doubt whether tvilas kelim was done. Yesh lahad bilo below bracha. You should be total without a bracha, because again, if you don't know whether you made the bracha, always brachas are lahakel, all brachas are rabbinic. And when we say brachas are lahakel, we don't invoke Hashem's name. Im yesh no sofik be'etzem chiyuv hakli bat vala, if there is a doubt whether, what's the status of that chiyuv, kli matches, if it's metal, matbilim below bracha. Im yesh no sofik be'etzem chiyuv hakli bat vala, kli matches matbilim below bracha. Kli zchuch is glass, mutarm be'etz hatzorch b'shimush apolo ad vala. If you have glass, it can be used even without immersion. There are very specific criteria for permitting this, which involve two distinct points of uncertainty. It's unclear if it was made by a Jew or Gentile. Plus, it's a ceramic with a glass glaze. So it's like the two sveikas. So with two sveikas, you can use it even without advala. Kelim shemavada einim sheicham advala. But let's say you don't really make or didn't have to do it. You're only doing it to avoid a bracha levatala, nachon sholach melabilan. Then you don't have to be toivelit. Now, let's go to 162. The requirement of klei suda. Not all kelim need hatvala. The requirement of tefillas kelim does not apply to all utensils, and not even all utensils that are used for food. Rather, it applies only to utensils that are used for the preparation of eating of food, known as klei suda. The source of this halacha is in the Gemara Avodah Zarah, Ayin Hey, Amrav Nachud, Amrav Maravua, Afilum kelim chadoshim b'mashma. That means if you have new kelim, it also needs hatbala. Da yishonim v'libnei. Let's say older kelim that had libun, which means white hot hagala, is kechachadoshim damu. Afilu hachi boy tefillah. It still needs tefillah if it transfers from the Gentile possession to a Jewish possession. What about scissors that a tailor uses? Or melei klei suda amuin b'parsha. The parsha of Midyan only talks about kelim that were used for food. So other metal utensils do not require. It's only klei suda. Rashi there, when it says the passage in the Torah refers to the pasuk from which tefillah is derived, and the reference to fire would only refer to utensils used for food. That means Daksiv called davar sheyavo ba'eish, any kli that is used with fire. The only kind of metal kelim that you use with fire are kelim that is used for food. Like you don't put scissors in a fire. Ubahanuksi v'tayr, on that pasuk, which talked about using kelim al yidei or that's when it said v'tar tvila. Aval zuzah desarvalolo, but scissors do not require. We're going to get to can opener. We're going to get because the question is, does it come in direct contact with food? So the Shulchan Aruch mentions this requirement of klei suda as well in the halacha that we saw earlier concerning the types of materials that are included in the mitzvah. Says the Shulchan Aruch in Yordei Kuf Chaf, Hakonim Agoy klei suda shel matchois. You notice he highlights the words klei suda. These are vessels used for food. It's metal or shel zchuchis, or kelim hamitzufim be'evim mebifnim, or it's coated with lead. Afal pi she'em chadoshim, even though they're new. Sorech latvila. Now we need to define what exactly is included in this classification of klei suda. Does it include any utensil that comes in contact with food? Or must the utensil actually be brought to the table to serve the food at the meal? And must the utensil touch the food directly? Or does supporting the food indirectly suffice? The Shulchan Aruch provides part of the answer to this question, where he rules that whatever does not directly touch the food is not considered a meal utensil, and consequently, it need not be immersed. Tripod. They used to make a tripod of sticks and put a pot on the tripod. So the tripod does not come in contact with the food. It only comes in contact with the pot. So therefore, those tripods, even though they're made out of metal, einam tu'unim tvila. Aval faldelish, which is grills, tu'unos tvila b'nei shenoisim aleim ha'mayich latzmo. You put food directly on the grill. So the grill requires tvila. So if you buy a new metal grill, and it's made by a Gentile or it's from a Gentile, it would require tefillah. If a utensil only has food placed directly on it occasionally, the Pri Chodesh writes that it's not considered klei suda, since we follow the primary usage of the utensil. Let's even though this tripod or stand sometimes is used for grilling directly, we look at the primary usage. Yes.
The grill, why does it have to be immersed if you're going to use it with fire? So shouldn't you burn it and that's it?
Remember, Mario, we're here in the sugya of Tvilas Kalim, which we've learned has nothing to do with kashering the Kalim. When you transfer a kli from the possession of a non-Jew to a Jew,
yes,
you need to put it in a mikveh. So it has nothing to do with kashering the kli. So what I'm saying is, if you buy a metal grill, that has to go into the mikveh as well before you use it.
All right. Okay.
Now, and then, of course, if it's been used before and you bought it from a Gentile, then it would need to be kasher. There's a big question whether you could kasher such a grill. Some say you can do libun gomer. Some hold we can't achieve libun gomer. There's a huge machlokas haposkim whether you can achieve libun gomer on any kind of grill which is directly exposed to fire.
Okay.
But that's a different. We're going to get to this sugya of hechsher kelim after we finish the sugya of tvilas kelim.
Okay.
Tvilas kelim is putting it in a mikveh of 40 saw, as if you converted the kli, just like a non-Jewish person has to go into the mikveh when he converts. So when you acquire the kli of a non-Jew, it also has to go into the mikveh. That's how you have to think about it. It has nothing to do with kashering it.
Okay. Thanks.
Is an item classified as a food utensil, even if it is used only to store food, but not to prepare food, or for use during eating? This is discussed by Rav Tzvi Cohen in the Sefer Tfilas Kelim. Bagbukim, bottles made out of glass. Okuf sa'ot, let's say you have a metal container. Shemachzikim bahem mishkaot, and let's say in that container you store liquids, or macholim kagon lechem, or bread, like a bread box, sukkar. People keep sugar for storage in a metal vessel, mine mafe, other kinds of breads, yerokos, chadome. Chayovin betvila. They are chayiv in tvila. That's only if you put the food directly into those containers, not in their sack. Means if you put food in a sack in a container, so that container that you put it in doesn't need tefillah. If these vessels are not brought to the table to eat, then you make the tefillah without a bracha. So that's important. So in fact, According to Tfilas Kalim, definition of clay suda includes even storage containers made out of metal or glass, provided the food comes in direct contact with the utensil, though no bracha is recited, unless they are actually brought to the table during a meal. Another interesting example that is discussed by the poskim is a nutcracker, which never comes into direct contact with the edible portion of the nut, but only with the shell. So you have to be toivel a nutcracker. According to some, it should be immersed without a bracha, but others have suggested that it may be completely exempt from immersion. This approach was adopted by Rav Vosner and the Shevet HaLevi. Yireh, it appears, the mefatzchei goes in a nutcracker, gora mizeh, the ein also rak lishmor klipa. Its only use is to break the shell. Masha'en came misparayim shel yerek. I guess scissors that are used to cut celery and other vegetables, she'oisa begufa yerek, that actually touches the food. The nutcracker rock, they just crack open the shell. Then you break it up with your hand. He thinks it's potter legamre, and at the very least, if you're going to be toivelit, you don't have to make a bracha. Another important dispute among the poskim involves utensils that do not come into contact at all with edible food. For example, a shchita knife, which is several steps removed from before the food can be eaten. Or let's say a meat grinder. The Ramah holds that one should toivel such utensils without a bracha, while the Shulchan Aruch rules that no immersion is necessary at all. Sakin shel shchita, yesh mishu omer she'eino tzarich tvila. Ramah says v'yesh chokim v'tov below bracha. So Ashkenazim are more machmir. Sefer HaKashrus says kelim aboim b'maga imozon v'shelvei haknaso harishonim, means in a very early stage of preparation where they're not ready to eat. Ve'adayin hamozon tzarich lachana nosefes la'achar shimush b'kli k'dei lakshir lachila matbilan lo bracha. He also says you do tefillah without a bracha. But if through that process the food becomes edible, then you need tefillah with a bracha. The Yalkut Yosef rules for Sfardim, in accordance with Shulchan Aruch, that utensils only used before the food is edible do not require tefillah at all. Chatzuva, sheshostin alei kedera. You have a stand where you put a pot on. Sometimes you would put bread to warm it up. You go after the majority where you don't put food directly on it, and therefore he holds its potter. He says the shchita knife does not require tefillah. It still needs to be cooked or roasted. It's not really food yet. Rechaim or madocha, a coffee grinder, any kind of grinder. You don't need tefillah. You have to cook it afterwards. You don't need it be'en. The culture can like an electric grinder. There's a concern that you may break it. You put this electric device in the mikvah, we hold she'eino tzricha tvila. Another aspect of clay suda is discussed by Rav Shlomo Zalman, is whether items that are normally separated from the food by a material or other item which acts as a barrier require tefillah. He rules that if the utensil is regularly separated from the food by a bag, it need not be immersed. However, if one uses a cloth or paper, the utensil must be immersed. Like in Israel, they sell milk in a plastic bag, and then they used to have some kind of thing that held the plastic bag to pour the milk. So they're asking about that thing that holds the milk in a bag. So if it's always used with the bag, near the choshev hefsek, there's a hefsek between the food and the kli, and then you don't need to be toivelet. But if a person uses a utensil only by spreading a cloth, the koshkin yarv nylon or paper nylon, near lanias daiti the ton tefillah bracha. Based on this idea, it would seem that oven trays require tefillah with a bracha, since although it is common to spread baking paper over them so that the food does not touch the tray directly, the paper is considered insignificant. Another important rule by the Shulchan Aruch is that clay food only require immersion when the owner intends to use them for the purpose of eating. If someone acquires utensils that could be used for food but without the intention to use them for food, those utensils need not be immersed. Therefore, you buy a metal pot, but you're only going to use it to hold pens, so that would not require tefillah. But the Ramah notes that one may not then use that utensil even temporarily for food purposes. If you're going to use it temporarily, you got to do tefillah. If you bought a certain utensil, initially you thought you were going to use it for food, but then you never use it for food. You only use it for cutting clothing. You don't need tefillah. Aval harishon, but you cannot use it temporarily for food without tefillah, even though you bought it for non-food purposes. Let's say a second Jew buys it from the first Jew, and l'tzorach suda, it needs tefillah. Or let's say the first owner was a non-Jew, then you have to do the tefillah. In the Ramah statement, he points out that a store owner may not toivel a utensil for the purchaser prior to the purchase. So we discussed this last week. If you're just a middleman and you're ordering kalim from a non-Jewish supplier and then you sell it to Jews, you're not the one who has to do the tefillah, because you're just a middleman. Your intent was never to use it for food, so you don't have to toivel it. The reason that the definition of a kli sud is applied only by the owner who tends to use the utensil for food. But the merchant defines the utensil as schoira, merchandise, rather than as a food item. This is seen from the Taz, who writes that one who buys utensils to sell his merchandise need not toivel them beforehand, based on the ruling of Shulchan Aruch. Lachtoch klipim, if you bought an item to cut non-food items, kosev beis Yosef hu adinim kno l'schoira. Or if you bought it for merchandise, ein tzarich tefillah. Sefer Kash's rules practically as well, that one must perform the tefillah only after the purchase, though b'diavad, if they are immersed beforehand, the new owner should immerse them only without a bracha. Balei chanios kelim, owners of a store that sells kelim. Hamatkinim b'chanutam mikveh lekelim l'shimush hakonim. He should have a mikveh in his store, so when people buy, they can dunk it. Tavalem brach amnam es hadbola yiptzu hakoinim la'achar avar sakila balusam. The owner of the store should not do it. He should sell it, and then once there's been transfer of ownership, they should do it. Mipnei shebe'ora kelim b'chanut kanam ha'moichel la'atzmo b'kinyan. He bought it. Lachein him kelim ha'ondim l'schoira v'lo l'suda. The chiyuv of tefillah did not start. Let's say the purchaser toiveled it without buying it. Let's say he was just checking it, somehow he toiveled it. When he buys it, he has to do it again once it comes into his possession, but of course without a bracha. Shlomo Zalman writes,
Ernie, I thought you taught us previously that if you're buying it from a Jew who's selling it to you, you don't have to do tefillah.
No. If the Jew bought it from a non-Jew, then the Jew, who is just the middleman as schoira, he doesn't have to be toivelit. But when he sells it to the Jew who buys it, the Jew who buys it has to be toivelit. Anytime it changes from non-Jewish to Jewish hands. The thing is, though, we said that the middleman, the one who owns the store, Bernie, doesn't have to be toivelit. Only the one he sells it to has to be toivelit. We see that very clearly from today's limud. We didn't really talk about. I said last week that we would learn the halach about merchants, and that's this Taz. It's a very important task. So if you're in business buying and selling kalim, and let's say you buy them from non-Jews, so the chiyuv is not on you to be toivel them because they're not klei suda. For you, they're just merchandise. When you sell it and the Jew who bought it uses it for a klei suda to prepare his food or to eat his food, then he has to be toivel. That's when the chiyuv tefillah starts. Okay? So Rav Shlomo Zalman writes that the same concept applies in a situation of a gift. One who gives a utensil that requires immersion to another as a gift also should not toivel it before giving it, as the immersion is effective only after the article is actually transferred to the recipient. That the kiven de etzel have klei schoyer, that means when a store owner doesn't be toivel it because it's a schoyer for him, he come makom harotzeli te maton al chaveiro yachol zakos lo lahadbil. You give a gift, you could be zoicha for him and be toivel it. We did zoch lonim shalom b'fonav. I can always acquire a gift on someone's behalf. But he's concerned that if, let's say, I was zoicha for my friend, maybe he doesn't want it. He's concerned that if you shouldn't do it through a process of zechiyah, you should give the gift and let the guy who received the gift be toivel. Because until that happens, you're not sure he's going to like the gift, or he's going to keep it, or he's going to use it for suda or not. Now, we're not going to learn at the iyun, but I would recommend highly that in your spare time, you look at page 171, which is the whole machlokas about corporations in halacha. What is a corporation? Is it a unique individual that stands its own, and then but it's really ownerless because it is an entity. It's a halachic entity, but without an owner, or is it considered that it is an owner? And by the way, Rav Shlomo Dechovsky, who's a very good friend of Tzvika, who's on the Beit Din HaGadol, brings a very interesting ruling with Rav Asher Weiss. And practically, so because for example, let's say you buy kalim that's sold by a corporation. That's what we're dealing with. Is that considered Gentile or not? So Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman rule that if you buy it from a corporation, you do have to do a tefillah with a bracha. Practically, it seems that the prevalent custom is to immerse one's utensils which were purchased from a corporation and to make a bracha. Some hold, though, you don't, because it's not really like somebody, like a non-Jew owned it, and therefore may not require tefillah. So at your own leisure, I recommend that you read through there, just because it's interesting to see how corporations are viewed in halacha, and the very fundamental shitos are listed there. Let's move on to page 181, which is the second portion of Hilchas Tfilas Kelim. We already saw in the previous shir that the Gemara Avodah Zarah derives that one must perform Tfilas Kelim in a kosher mikveh containing 40 saw of rainwater. This is the passage in Avodah Zarah. Tana. The kulan trichen tefillin bar boim saw. You need tefillin bar boim saw. Menani miliadu, we know this. Tani bar kapora. Mitoch shenemar b'mei nida. Shomeani shetzarech hazar shlishi v'shvi. Now, mei nida could also refer to someone who's been metami with tumas mace and requires para aduma sprinkling on them on the third and seventh day. Talmud loimer ach b'mei nida chilek. It says it's a distinction. You don't need to do any hazah on the third and seventh day. Im kain ma Talmud loimer b'mei nida. So what are we learning from b'mei nida? Mayim shenida toivelos b'hen. It refers to water that a woman who is a nida is toivelin. Hevi oimer arboin sa. That teaches us that the tefillah we're talking about here by kalim is tefillah in a mikveh of 40 sa. Now, in addition to classic mikveh, tefillah may also be performed in other bodies of water, including the ocean or a ma'ayan, a spring. Let's say you're on a trip. You don't have access to a kosher mikveh. So the Shulchan Aruch says, "Mei ma'ayan mitarim af bezochlin." Flowing spring water are mitar even if they're flowing. Make shamim and mitarim ela ba'ashborin. Rainwater has to be gathered in a set place, like that's a mikveh. Says the Ramah, "Aval yadeh zechila psulim in a Torah, imhem lechud below mayan." Means just because there's running water, they're not. It has to be connected to a natural spring and running, in order for it to be mitayir. Kol hayomim, mean the oceans, yesh lehem din mayim l'tar b'schila. They have the power of being mitayir in flowing situations. The Rishonim dispute whether a mayan containing flowing water, does that require 40 saw like a mikveh or not? According to the Rambam, it does, but the Tur disagrees. The Tur says, "Because of the Sefer Mitzvos, avalo b'mayin afal gav d'mayin mitar b'kli tamei b'kol you can't have just a little bit of water. That means even by a ma'ayan, according to the Sefer Mitzvos La Rambam, you need 40 saw. Says the Tur v'lo nehira. It's not clear to me. Why should we Why should we be more machmir here than the din by a vessel that's actually tameh, where we don't have such a din? And therefore, since we're learning, the whole thing is learned out from Tumah v'Tahara. It can't be more stringent than that. However, the Shulchan Aruch is machmir like the Rambam, that even if you're being toivel in a spring, a natural spring, it can't just be a little bit of water. It's got to have 40 saw in it. Or lead line. So he says very clearly, it's got to be a mikveh or mayan of arboim saw. The Sefer Tfilas Kelim adds that although the water in a river or ma'ayan is not all gathered in one spot, the entire body of water from one end to the other may nevertheless combine to the 40 saw. Ma'ayanot v'narot mitarim af kishmemem zormim, even though there's water is flowing, they're not gathering in one place. If you can see from one end to the other end of the water source is more than 40 saw, that's enough. So the custom in most places today is to immerse utensils in a kelim mikveh, which is a small mikveh usually attached to and located next to the main mikveh. One who goes on vacation, though, or does not live near a regular mikveh may make use of the ocean for tfilas kelim. The din of nida is more complex on a practical level, and we will learn that Mirz Hashem in the future. The Aruch HaShulchan explains that as long as it is connected to the main mikveh, it's kosher, even if it's small, because there's a principle of hashaka. Means if you have a kosher mikveh of 40 saw, and then there's a body of water attached to it, so the smaller body of water gets the purification power of a mikveh. The Aruch HaShulchan says, it's non bereish perik vav de mikvos, kol ha'ma'urev le'mikvah k'mikvah. Any body of water connected to a mikveh is like a mikveh. So therefore, chorei ha'ma'arav, let's say you have holes in a cave, which are connected to the spring in the cave, or cracks in the cave. Matbil bahem kamashem. You can be toivel in them, even if there's only a few, there's not 40 saw in that crack, but the crack of water is connected to the main mikveh, so that's already okay. And that's how these small keli mikvahs that are attached to the main mikvah work as well. Madvilam kamashem. Chen kasva tur v'shulchan aruch b'simin reish aleph v'zul l'shonam chorei ha'ma'ara v'stoki ha'ma'ara, holes or cracks in a cave. Madvilam behem. Afal pishen ha'mayim shebehem u'rovim imei ha'mikveh el b'chol shu. There's only a small connection with the main mikvah, but that's okay. Ad kan l'shonam. Kivan t'tfilas kelim yelfin ha'mikra. The whole thing is learned from Parshas of Midyan, Shezeu Kitfilas Nida, where we compare to Nida and Mela, the Gabahem Adin came. that ולכן כשיש סמוך למקווה מים מועטים בגומה בפני עצמה, let's say next to the main mikveh there's a crack and there's some water connected there, והם מחוברים עם מי המקווה, they're connected to the מי המקווה, and as long as you can immerse the kli in that crack, והכלי מסקס בהם יכול לטבול שם. וכן כוזב אחד מגדולי האחרונים, דמדני יונטב, in the divrei chamudos, that it's kosher, and we use that heter with the kelim mikvah. Page 184. Another aspect of the preparation of utensils for tefillah is to make sure there's no chatzitza, that it's clean, there's no dirt, rust, or any other substance. Let's say there are stickers, decals, right, that will prevent the water of the mikveh from coming in direct contact with the utensils. Such interpositions are known as chatzitza and may invalidate the tefillah if they're not removed. The Gemara Nida discusses different types of chatzitzos. On Rav Yitzchak, Dvar Torah, Ruba Makpid Allah Chotzeitz. Let's say a person has a chatzitza on the majority of his body, and you're makpid on it, and you don't want that material to be there. It's certainly a chatzitza. Even Ruba Ve'eno Makpid Allah ain't a chatzitz. Me'ikar adin, if your body is covered, the majority of your body, with something, but you're not makpid on that thing. Me'ikar adin, it's not chotzitz. However, gozru al rubo she'ena makpid mishum ruba makpid. However, Chacham made a gzeira that even if it's the majority of your body is covered with something, but you don't care about that thing, so that they made a gzeira that it is a chatzitza. Now, the gozral miuto amakbid mishum rubo amakbid. Now, let's say the minority of your body is covered with something, but it's something that you don't want on you, so that's a gzeira as well because of the rubo amakbid. So there are three situations where it's going to be a chatzitza. The only time it's not a chatzitza is if it's not covering the majority of your body and you're not makpid. More of a ligzer nami al miuto she'ena makpid mishum miuto de makpid. More says that itself is a goof of gzeira. We don't make double gzeiras. So, and you can see the chart that they've created, that the only one that's not a chatzitza is if it doesn't cover the majority of the body or the utensil, and we're not makpid on it. And Shulchan Aruch accepts it directly from the Gemara as the halacha. Kol davar shederech lahakpid alav chotzeitz. V'im lav ein chotzeitz. So you see, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say anything about rov or not rov. He just talks about hakpada. So anytime you're makpid, whether it's majority or not majority, it's chotzeitz. Now, if you're not makpid, ein chotzeitz. Ela im ken hayachoypes rubo. That's how the Shulchan Aruch stated it. In one sentence, he gave us the whole summary. So if you're not makpid, it's still chotzeitz if it covers the majority of your body. Says the Ramah, shcharuris hadovik biyor mibachutz. Let's say you have black, charred black on a cauldron that is charred on the outside. Heavy kidofna kliva darka b'kach ve'ena chotzitz. So that's not considered a chatzitza. It becomes part of the wall of the kli, and therefore you could be toivel without any problem. The Shulchan Aruch and the halachos of tefillas Kelim stresses that lechatchila one must try to remove any stains or other foreign material on the utensil prior to tefillah, regardless of how small or insignificant. However, if one did not, this is the status of the tefillah. The status is, as we said above, if you're makpid, and no matter what, and if it's covering the majority, even if you're not makpid, those tefillahs would not be good, and you'd have to be toivel it, right? Chaluda is rust, so you have to remove it. So in makpid of chotzitz. If you scrubbed it and you cold it, the nishar adayin me'achel chaluda shlo yachal lav al yidei kach, it becomes a minority shade, and then it's okay. Sefer HaKashrus summarizes, if you have an item which is choitzitz, and it's only on a minority of the kli, and ein rov bnei adam makpidim al hamitzit, and most people don't care about this. Uvikalam gam balei hakli, even the owner of the kli, after lahapilas hakli machatzitza, achel lechatchila yesh lasir gam chatzitza kshekazu. He says that's only b'diavad dikidin. Lechatchila you should try to get rid of it. Based on these rules, one should make sure to remove any stickers present on the utensil when it was purchased. Though if one specifically desires that it remain there permanently, then it does not constitute a chatzitza when we leave it in place. Let's say you buy a vessel in a kosher store and it says fleshik on it, and there's a decal. So that's a decal that you're not makpid on. So that's a perfect good. You want it to stay there, and therefore you could be toivel the kli, and it's not considered a chatzitza. Is that an interesting halach?
Yeah, very.
Okay. Another case of potential chatzitza involves a person who holds the utensil too tightly in his hand when immersing it. According to the Mishnah Mikvos, the immersion is invalid in such a case because the water is prevented from touching the surface of the utensil by the person's grasp. The solution given is to avoid this problem is to wet one's hands beforehand. That means if you washed your hands and there's water on it, then it's okay. Based on this, the Shulchan Aruch writes that one should hold the utensil loosely when immersing it, so that one's hands do not constitute chatzitza. So actually, a kli roughly biyot should be loose in your hands. B'shas tvila, shemahadko, if you hold it tight, biyot v'chitzitza v'imlachlos yoda b'mayim tchila ein lachosh. But if you wet your hands in the water before you did it, then it's not a problem. Now, what about how do you do the tefillah? Rabbeinu Tam writes in the Sefer HaYashar that one must make sure to immerse the entire utensil into the mikveh at one time. This is a big nafkamina from Hagalos Kelim. So, for example, those of you who have used the services of David Tumim before Pesach, when you want to be machshir your kelim with Hagalos Kelim, let's say you have a kli that has absorbed chametz through hot water. So, kaboilo kachpalto, the way a kli absorbs is the way you get it out of there. So you have a big garbage can full of boiling water, and that's not tvilas kelim, that's hachsharas kelim, that's hagalas kelim. There, you see many times David would dip it twice. He wouldn't necessarily immerse the whole thing at one time. You could immerse the kli in one direction with that way, and then you can go and immerse it in the other direction. We're going to see by tfilas kelim, you need to immerse the kli in one shot. Says the Sefer HaYashar, Mikol mokem arboim so boy, shi'e golgufa olo behen v'lo chatzoin. The whole kli has to go in there, not half of it. V'chein kosev Rav Achoy, now that's Rav Achoy Gaon, right? The Gaonim lived, Rabbeinu Tam is the grandchild of Rashi. So you're talking about Rabbeinu Tam lived 1150, 1200, something like that. Now the Gaonic period was 800, 900, 1000 in Baghdad. So you had Rav Hai Gaon, you had Rav Sadia Gaon, you had Rav Achai Gaon. And so they had collected, Rabbeinu Tam certainly had access to the Gaonic literature. So he writes, "V'chein kosev Rav Achoy b'parshas Achrei Mos, u'v'toras Kohanim v'mkomos tu v'tanya, ma b'yash shimshu kulo ke'echad." Just like when the sun goes down, it's one sun. Af b'yosu b'mayim kulo ke'echad. So too, the purification has to be at one shot. Lafuke tfilas chatzoin. The Pischei Tshuva lived in Bialystok at a very young age, like 15 or 18. He wrote the Pischei Tshuva, which was like a Mishnah Brura on all other areas of Shulchan Aruch except Orach Chaim. But he lived from like 1850 to 1870. And remember, the Shulchan Aruch was written in like 1500. So that 300 years, a lot of shilas had arisen. So the Pischei, just like the Mishnah Berurah did the same thing in Orach Chaim. Now, he wasn't, remember, the Mishnah Berurah of Chaim, there was the Lavush had already written 100 years before certain modifications of the Shulchan, or newer halachas since the Shulchan Aruch was written. Mishnah Berurah updated it. So the Pischei Tshuva is the same kind of work where all the halachas are updated, siman by siman, but that's with your Deach, Choshen Mishpat, and Even HaEzer. You can read the biography of the Pischei Tshuva. He's a major source of halacha for all of us, because especially in non-Orach Chaim, because he brings us up to date to mid-19th century. Pischei Tshuva notes that concerning this point, Tfilas Kelim differs from Agolas Kelim, kashering, utensils and boiling water, which we're going to learn in the next year, for which the utensil may be placed in the water in two stages. Koser b'Sefer Chochmas Adam. So remember Rav Danzig, right? The Chayei Adam, we know the Chayei Adam because that's on the Orach Chaim, right? But the Chochmas Adam was the same. Rav Danzig also on Yoredeya. He operated in the 1700s, the Chayei Adam. So you see, the Pischei Tshuva is updating the halacha by quoting the Chochmas Adam. Because of the Chochmas Adam, you have to put the whole kli at one shot. But if it's big, this is talking about Hagalas Kelim. This is by Tfilas Kelim, that if it's too big, you're out of luck, because you got to be able to do Tfilas Kelim in one shot. He says, Hagala is to remove the prohibited flavor that's absorbed in the walls. So we don't care. So for example, we know if you go to a Bezdin to visualize a conversion, and the non-Jew is taken to the mikveh, you got to bring him, he has to go in the mikveh completely. He can't like put half of his body in the mikveh and then upside down the other half of the body. He has to be completely immersed. So in this Zushnel that we developed, and last week we learned from the Ritva, I think, that it's similar to conversion. So this kli has to be immersed in one shot, because it has nothing to do with kashrus or not kashrus. But kashrus has to do with getting the absorbed flavor out of the wall. So we don't care if you dipped half the kli in one way and half the kli the other way, as long as every square inch of that kli went into the hot water, that process got rid of the absorbed flavor. Right? Kivan she'igla mixes are hiflit. Avalach mishum tuma v'kivan shnisha mikzeh mimena chutz l'mayim choyzer mispashi b'chol hakli ad kan. You gotta give something else, that there's some kind of tuma in this kli that you bought from a goy. So if you only toiveled 90% of it and 10% was out of the water, in a sense, the moment you take it out of the water, the tuma that was in the 10% now spreads into the whole kli again.
But you can total half and then the other half?
No, not by Tfilas Kelim. Only by Hagalas Kelim. That's why I made the distinction. By Hagala, you can do it in two shots because of the Svara. There, all we need to do is get the absorption out. So we don't care how we do it. But here, it's got to be done in one shot. Like I tried to make the Tzushtel with a ger going into the mikveh. He can't put his hand in, then the other hand in, and then a leg in, and be toivel his body. It's got to be done in one
For
shot.
Tahara purposes. Now, what happens when you have a kli that like has a motor where if you put the whole thing in, it'll damage it? Okay.
Chaim, very good. So we're going to have that, God willing, a tvila for electric utensils coming up. Let's see if we can get there tonight.
Have a sandwich maker.
We're going to have sandwich maker. Hang on. Shulchan Aruch notes that not only the primary position of the utensil must be toiveled all at once, but the handles as well. The handles have to be toivel. The Tfilas Kalim Sefer adds that one need not take apart the handles. One simply immerses the utensil with the handle at one time in the water. Ein tzarich lefarekes yadita kli. You don't have to break it. You don't have to separate or dismantle this. Or chalakim acherim mechubarim leki, or separate pieces. Afilei nami minat tona tefila, even if it's made out of something that you don't have to be toifel. Elamatfil kishay mechubarim lekli. Achdinam kegufa kli shetzarich lios makibel of chatzitza. The handles have to be clean without chatzitza. When immersing utensils in the mikvah, one may place them in a net or tie them so they do not fall down to the bottom of the mikvah. This is evident from the following case in Shulchan Aruch, which permits placing one utensil inside another. Kli tamei, this is in a different sugya of tumah, shenosim besocha kelim acherim, and you put other vessels, let's say you put silverware into a pot. V'hit bilakol, also lametfil, it works. Even though the opening is narrow, but the water gets in there. We talk also it works for the big kli, it works for the little kalim inside. If you tilted it on its side, the opening has to be wide. In order to get you have to get two fingers in easily and move it around. It's got to be that size of two fingers. The Darchei Moshe writes that even if the opening is smaller than the requisite amount, one may still fill it up with water from the faucet, and when one immerses, the water will be made to come in contact with the mikveh water, and the tefillah is effective through a mechanism known as hashaka. Like we said before, kissing. That means, let's say you can only put one finger in. So you fill up the kli in water, then put it in the mikveh. The water that's in the kli will become connected to the water in the mikveh, and then it's okay. It's already entered inside. How can you be toivel a kli that the opening is narrow? First, you got to fill it with water. Even if it's not mikveh water. However, without the water, if you can't put two fingers into the opening, it's not going to be a good feeling. What bracha do you make? Right? The Mordechai cites the Rashbam, who mentions three different opinions as to the correct text of the bracha. Kosev Rashbam, V'yesh levarach aleim ala tefillah. V'yesh mevarchim al tefillas kelim. V'yesh mevarchim al tefillas kli. Matches. He actually described what metal. Shelo yebemash b'shar kelim she'ena matches. To clearly show that you're not including, non-metal. The Shulchan Aruch follows the Tur, who follows the second opinion, but distinguishes between immersing one utensil and immersing multiple utensils. Yidvarach al tfilas kli, that's if you have one kli. The imhem shnayim o yoiser, mevarach al tfilas kelim. The Aruch HaShulchan explains that the text of al tfilas kelim was preferred by the Shulchan Aruch, since we do not generally mention the type of material subject to the mitzvah and the bracha. Plus, the words of ala tefillah are too general, could refer to the immersion of a nida, which is the more classic case of tefillah. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, yesh shekosv levarach al tefillas kli matris, however, ein ikr. Chada, that's not the ikr adin. Chada shreigam al kli zchuchis, anu mitzuvim kemosh, the same way, kemosh kosu. We have to be toivel glassware as well. The other kol brachos hamitzvos ein maskim bebracha prati adinim. In all brachos hamitzvos, we don't go into detail like that. Ben lomadim ken lama lanu laskir klal kelim. So then he asks himself, maybe we shouldn't have to say tfilas kelim. Name ala tfila bilvad. The Tzurba they should stam tfila v'tfilas isha. Much more common tfilas when women go to the mikveh. V'raya sharei be'emet ha'isha mevrechel stam ala tefillah. K'mo shekosu, v'chen yesh levar dezav b'tfilas kelim. Aval prati adinim ein laskir babrok. You don't have to say, klei matchas. Rosh Shlomo Zalman notes that if one toivels a pot together with the lid, this is considered one utensil and not two. Therefore, you still say al tfilas kli. Hamadvil michse im siro. If you were toivel the pan with its pot, with its lid, even though you might use another pot, another open lid, can I see that? I think I'm going to leave tefillah for electric utensils for next week.
Yeah.
And then we will finish, God willing, tefillas kelim. There's other dinim that we're going to entertain in this. So you still, and then we will start hagolas kelim, kashering as well. I think we'll begin that. We won't finish it. Hechsher Kalim is one chapter. Then we'll have Yayin Nesach, which is going to be a very, very interesting sugya. So we still have a lot of Yordea to do. I believe volume 6 is also Yordea. So we have Ashgacha, Mashgiach, Nemanus. And then the Bedika and Bir Chometz, we will save for right before Pesach, God willing. Okay, any questions?